Hamilton is back to Mercedes. On TV, they only showed Lewis Hamilton's press conference. But do you want to know the offer Toto Wolff made to him right after the Hungarian Grand Prix? Then this video is for you. Subscribe to stay informed about the latest Formula One news. The atmosphere in Maranello had become something far more volatile than quiet. It was suffocating. Every corner of the factory reeked of tension. Every glance between engineers felt loaded with subtext. Gone were the celebratory voices, the laughter over espresso cups, the echoes of tradition and pride that once made Ferrari a fortress of passion. In their place, awkward silences, hurried footsteps, and whispers that stopped the moment a senior figure entered the room. The Australian Grand Prix hadn't just exposed cracks in Ferrari's structure, it had detonated them. It ripped apart the illusion that everything was under control. It laid bare the ugly reality that the team, one of the most historic and prestigious in motorsport, was at war with itself. And at the center of it all stood Lewis Hamilton, once hailed as the man destined to return the prancing horse to glory, now wandering through the wreckage of a project collapsing under the weight of its own expectations. There were no comforting smiles from the garage after Melbourne. No pats on the back. No shared camaraderie. Hamilton climbed out of the SF-25 and stared blankly at the floor. His body language wasn't that of a man frustrated by a tough race. It was the quiet surrender of a warrior who had been forced to fight alone for far too long. His voice in the post-race interview was almost ghost-like, subdued, drained, hollow. "I feel useless out there," he muttered, eyes unfocused. "I push every lap, I follow the data, I trust the process, and yet, here I am again. I'm not the issue. You see Charles putting it on pole. Same car, different treatment. That tells you everything." To the public, it was a crack in the surface. But to those inside Ferrari, it was a bomb going off in slow motion. What happened next didn't make the airwaves. It wasn't televised. It didn't trend on social media. But those who were in the room, those who heard every word, every insult, every accusation, know exactly what it meant. Subscribe to stay informed about the latest Formula One news. Vasseur, the man trusted with reshaping Ferrari's future, confronted Hamilton just hours after the race. It wasn't a calm, strategic conversation. It wasn't the mutual respect between a team principal and a world champion. It was raw, explosive, personal. "You're not fit to drive for Ferrari," Vasseur snapped, voice ice-cold. The words weren't shouted. They were delivered like a death sentence. Hamilton didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. But what he said in return chilled every person within earshot. "Then build me a car worthy of Ferrari." The room froze. Nobody spoke. Mechanics looked at the floor. Engineers clenched their jaws. Data analysts held their breath. No one had ever seen a confrontation like it inside those red walls. Not between a driver of Hamilton's magnitude and a team principal holding Ferrari's fate in his hands. In the days that followed, the silence said more than any press release ever could. Hamilton didn't show up to simulator sessions. Ferrari cancelled several media obligations. Briefings were held in separate rooms. Engineers from Hamilton's side of the garage stopped collaborating with Leclerc's team. What had once been a united front began to resemble two competing factions wearing the same color. And then, just when the situation seemed like it couldn't get more fragile, an internal document was leaked. A set of performance evaluations comparing car response data between both drivers across the first 3 races. The report didn't blame Hamilton. In fact, it validated him. It showed that his driving style, smoother, more methodical, more balanced, was fundamentally incompatible with the rear-end instability baked into the SF-25's chassis philosophy. The car hadn't been designed to suit both drivers. It had been unintentionally tailored for Leclerc's aggressive high-input approach. Ferrari had created a single-lane machine and expected 2 world-class drivers to race in it. Hamilton's frustrations weren't just justified. They were mathematically proven. But what shocked insiders most wasn't the document, it was who leaked it. Speculation spread like wildfire that a senior engineer from within the team, frustrated by internal politics and deeply loyal to Hamilton, had passed the file to a journalist under the condition of anonymity. It was an act of desperation, not sabotage. A final attempt to force Ferrari to confront the reality they were avoiding. By the time the team regrouped for Suzuka, nothing was normal. Hamilton arrived late. He skipped Thursday's promotional events. He walked through the paddock with his hoodie pulled over his head, AirPods in, avoiding eye contact with the media. During practice, his communication with the team was minimal. Short, terse, almost robotic. In the garage, his body language told the full story. No engagement with strategists, no back and forth with his engineers, no spark. He qualified outside the top 10 again. He finished the race 7th. Subscribe to stay informed about the latest Formula One news. But in the cool-down room, he didn't speak a word. Not to Leclerc. Not to Vasseur. Not even to his own performance coach. He was mentally done. What no one saw coming, however, was what unfolded the next morning. Hamilton's management quietly reached out to multiple rival teams. Not formally, not contractually, but the intention was clear. Audi was first on the list. McLaren was informed. Even Aston Martin was reportedly made aware that a conversation with Hamilton's camp might soon be possible, if things continued to deteriorate. And just like that, the paddock changed overnight. Ferrari's 2025 season was no longer about titles or trophies. It was about survival. Inside Maranello, leadership scrambled. Emergency meetings were held. Technical teams were told to reprioritize Hamilton's feedback in all ongoing developments. Updates planned for Barcelona were suddenly being fast-tracked for Imola. A complete re-evaluation of the car's balance philosophy was initiated. Vasseur, realizing the storm he had helped unleash, reportedly requested a private meeting with Hamilton to clear the air. But the question now wasn't about upgrades. It wasn't about floor geometry or aero balance. It was about trust. And once lost, especially at Ferrari, trust is nearly impossible to reclaim. Hamilton didn't come to Maranello for paycheck or legacy. He came for a mission. He came to bring Ferrari back to where they belonged, the very top of Formula One. And now, standing in the ruins of that ambition, he was starting to look at the one thing he never thought he'd consider so soon. An exit. Not in shame. Not in failure. But in refusal to continue being the face of a machine that wouldn't listen to the very man it had begged to lead it. Ferrari's silence had become a scream. And if they didn't act, boldly, decisively, and without ego, they would soon lose the most iconic name in motorsport all over again. Not because he gave up, but because he finally knew when to walk away. Unseen by the cameras, untouched by the chaos of the paddock, and far beyond the reach of the headlines that had already ignited a global media wildfire, something deeper was unfolding. Long before the tire smoke from Melbourne had dissipated into the cool night air, one man, deliberate, calculating, and unfailingly loyal, had been watching. Not just as a spectator, not just as a former boss, but as someone who once built an empire around a single man. And when that man began to crack under the weight of the red machine, he knew it before anyone else. Toto Wolff had been quiet since Hamilton's shocking defection to Ferrari. No press tirades. No strategic leaks. Just silence, interviews filled with generic well-wishes, and a composed front that masked something far more human underneath. Because what the world didn't see, what no reporter could ever capture, was the bond forged in the crucible of dominance. The shared scars of defeat. The silent glances across pit walls that spoke louder than radios ever could. Lewis wasn't just a former employee to Toto. He was legacy. He was history. He was family. And now, that family was in ruins. Mercedes had tried to pivot. George Russell had taken the baton with confidence and consistency, sharp in qualifying and clinical on Sundays. And Andrea Kimi Antonelli, the highly anticipated protege with raw electric speed, had been given his shot. The future had arrived. At least, that's what the headlines said. But in truth, the cracks were already spiderwebbing beneath the surface. Antonelli's opening stint in Formula One had been brutal. Not because of lack of talent, but because of timing. The weight of expectation, the burden of replacing a legend, the cameras following his every twitch, all of it had been too much. He locked up in Bahrain, bottled an overtake in Jeddah. And in Melbourne, he spun under pressure, dropping the team from a double points finish to a humiliating 11th. 3 races in, and the kid looked shattered. The paddock no longer whispered, it roared. Mercedes was bleeding, and the future was still a boy learning how to breathe under pressure. And as for Lewis, his post-race interview was the final spark. "I feel useless," he had said, eyes hollow, voice empty. The statement cut through the motorsport world like a dagger. Fans debated. Pundits speculated. Was this the beginning of the end? But for Toto, it wasn't a moment of pity. It was a sign. A signal that the fire was still there, buried beneath the rubble of political infighting and strategic blunders in Maranello. Hamilton wasn't finished. He was suffocating. And Toto had seen enough. So he made the call. No assistant. No scheduling team. No delay. Just 5 words. A whisper from the past. We need to talk. Tonight. No time zones. No negotiations. The message was received, understood, and executed. That night, under a thick curtain of stars on the industrial outskirts of Melbourne, far from the blinding lights of Formula One's theater, 2 men met in a place chosen not for luxury but for secrecy. A concrete garage, empty save for 2 chairs, a metal table, and a single flickering lamp that hummed softly in the silence. Hamilton arrived first. Hoodie pulled low over his face, steps quiet, his entire posture hunched from the emotional weight he had been carrying for months. This wasn't the same man who had walked into Ferrari with fanfare and flashbulbs. This was a man stripped raw, disillusioned, bitter, yet still burning inside with something primal. Toto arrived minutes later. No entourage. No theatrics. Just him. Standing tall. His eyes were sharp with purpose, but behind them, concern. Not for reputation. Not for contracts. But for Lewis. Hamilton didn't speak at first. He stared at the floor, his jaw clenched, mind still processing the fallout of what felt like betrayal by the very dream he had chased. Toto broke the silence. Didn't think I'd have to call, he said, voice even, arms crossed over his chest. But I've seen enough. Lewis looked up slowly, expression unreadable. Didn't think I'd hear from you, he replied, barely above a whisper. There was no handshake. No need. What passed between them wasn't about formalities. It was about truth. Toto stepped forward, pulled out a chair, and sat. Is this what you signed up for? He asked, not accusatory, just direct. Lewis leaned back, arms folded, staring at the lamp's weak glow. I signed up for a challenge. Not a delusion. I thought I could fix it. That they wanted to win. But they want an icon, not a fighter. They wanted your name, Toto replied, nodding. Not your fire. Hamilton exhaled slowly, his voice cracking slightly. They tell you to be patient. That the car will come. That the vision is long-term. But every week it's the same. Late updates, slow pit stops, confusing calls. No clarity. No spine. Toto didn't smile, but his eyes said I knew this would happen. I've watched you suffer, he said. I've watched Ferrari waste what they don't understand. But I also watched what you said after the race. And you're not done, Lewis. You're angry. Good. Anger means there's still something left. Lewis blinked, eyes suddenly glassy. You think I made a mistake? Wolff leaned forward, eyes locked. No. I think you gambled on love. On history. You wanted to be their savior. But Lewis, you don't save a sinking ship by jumping into the water with it. There was a long pause. Then Hamilton spoke again. I can't go back, Toto. Toto nodded slowly. Maybe not today. Maybe not this season. But let's stop pretending this ends in red. Silence. Then Toto reached into his jacket and pulled out a small black envelope. No logo. No seal. Just clean, minimalist paper. He slid it across the table. No pressure. No timeline. But when you're ready, open it. Hamilton stared at it. Didn't touch it. Just breathed. Toto stood, buttoned his coat, and headed for the door. But before leaving, he turned back. You're not useless, he said. You're just in the wrong machine. And then he was gone. Lewis sat there for a long time, alone, the sound of the distant freeway buzzing in the background. The envelope lay in front of him like a loaded weapon. He didn't open it. Not yet. But he didn't throw it away either. Because deep down, in the part of him that still dreamed of eighths and legacies and rewriting history, he knew. This story wasn't finished. It was just about to change course. There was silence between them for a long moment. The kind of silence that doesn't need to be filled. The kind that carries decades of history, heartbreak, triumph, and unspoken truths. And when Toto finally broke it, his voice was calm, not soft, but deliberate. Not angry, but deeply wounded. Lewis. I watched you this weekend. Lewis didn't look up. He stood near the floor-to-ceiling window in the suite above the Monza paddock, still in his undershirt, body drained, eyes unfocused. Toto stepped closer, his words growing firmer with each step. I watched the interviews. I listened to your voice. I saw the way your eyes didn't spark anymore. That wasn't you out there. That wasn't the man who defied the odds in Istanbul. That wasn't the warrior who dragged a limping W13 into podium contention against all logic. That wasn't the driver who made miracles feel routine. Hamilton stayed quiet, jaw clenched, gaze fixed on something distant. Maybe the pit lane, maybe his past. That, Toto continued, was a man unraveling. A man being hollowed out by a team that never understood the depth of who he is. They dressed you in red and thought the color would do the work. But Ferrari never embraced you, Lewis. Not the person. Not the leader. Not the soul. Lewis exhaled, sharp and heavy, his arms crossing tightly over his chest as if trying to keep himself from falling apart. They don't see you, Toto said. Not really. To them, you were never a captain. You were a campaign. A symbol. A brand extension. A trophy to parade. They polished your image, but never listened to your voice. Lewis finally muttered, low and broken, you warned me. Toto didn't move. He just nodded. I did. Not out of ego. Not because I wanted to be proven right. But because I know you. I know what you need to thrive. And I knew they couldn't give it to you. They wanted to tame you, Lewis. Reshape you. Break the very spirit that made you unstoppable. Hamilton let out a bitter breath and turned slightly, finally letting his eyes meet Toto's. There was pain in them. Regret. But also a flicker of something else. Something deeper. Something still alive. He paused, voice cracking. I just wanted to make history. To do something nobody else has done. To win with them. To conquer the impossible. That's all I ever wanted. Toto didn't blink. And you can still make history. But not like this. Not under people who smother your fire and call it strategy. Not with a car that doesn't speak your language. Not surrounded by engineers who flinch every time you ask for answers. He took one more step forward. No longer a team boss. A friend. A brother in arms. Come back, Lewis. Come home. Those words didn't echo. They detonated in the space between them. They came heavy with years of memories behind them. The champagne in Abu Dhabi, the heartbreak in Brazil, the nights they stayed long after the garage closed, trying to find one more tenth. Hamilton shook his head slowly, a sad smile tugging at his lips. Home doesn't always open the door for the ones who left. But Toto's response was instant. Unflinching. Unshakable. Ours does. I do. There was something primal in the silence that followed. Like the moment before a storm, when every cloud in the sky holds its breath. Lewis looked down at his hands, the same hands that had gripped titles, waved flags, held trophies, and now, trembled slightly with uncertainty. I'm not the same driver I was, he said softly. Toto tilted his head. No. You're better. You're wiser. Stronger. More dangerous than ever. Because now, you're not just racing for yourself. You're racing to reclaim everything they tried to take from you. Lewis looked away again, swallowing hard. They've drained me, T. Every race. Every debrief. Every mistake they won't own. I feel like I'm speaking a different language and nobody's listening. Toto nodded. Because they aren't. You're talking championship, they're whispering PR. You're asking for accountability, and they're passing blame. And while you're fighting ghosts in red, your story, your legacy, is being twisted into a footnote. Hamilton paced slightly, trying to make sense of everything twisting inside him. The roar of Monza's engines in the distance. The weight of red on his shoulders. The scar tissue Ferrari had left on his soul. You have George. You have Antonelli coming up the ranks. Why would you even want me back? Because we're not fighting for fifth, Toto said sharply. We're not here to exist. We're here to conquer. Kimmy's not ready. George can't carry this alone. I need a commander. A general. Someone who knows what it means to bleed for every millisecond. Someone who terrifies the grid the moment they put the helmet on. He took a breath. Slower now. Quieter. Mercedes was never just a team. It was a rebellion. You were that rebellion. And without you, the fight feels incomplete. Hamilton's eyes were glassy now. Not from weakness, but from everything he'd kept bottled up since the day he signed the Ferrari contract. The pressure. The isolation. The burden of proving everyone wrong, even when the machine refused to cooperate. He leaned against the glass, staring at the Ferrari logo painted on the garage across the paddock. I gave them everything. I believed in the dream. You still can chase the dream, Toto said gently. But you don't have to do it alone. Lewis closed his eyes. And for the first time in months, he felt like someone had just offered him oxygen. A way out. A way forward. A way home. He didn't speak again. But deep down, something had shifted. And in that moment, far above the roar of the crowd, far beyond the reach of cameras, two men who once built an empire realized that maybe, just maybe, the greatest chapter of their story was still unwritten. Toto Wolff stood in front of Lewis Hamilton, arms crossed, eyes scanning the man he once called his greatest asset. But this wasn't the same Lewis he had signed over a decade ago. This wasn't the world-conquering, relentless, untouchable champion of 2020. No, the man in front of him was different. He was older, weathered, emotionally bruised, but there was something new behind his eyes. Something darker. Sharper. Hungrier. Something reborn. And Toto saw it. Every inch of it. He gave a small nod, barely more than a twitch of the chin, but it spoke volumes. No, he said quietly, voice laced with gravity. You're not the same. You're better. Because now you've tasted the kind of defeat that doesn't just sting, it scars. You've felt real loss. Real humiliation. You've stood at the edge of irrelevance and didn't jump. He took a step closer. And now you understand the price of greatness. The true cost. Not in podiums, not in trophies, but in identity. You've been stripped bare, and what's left is exactly what we need. A long silence followed. No engineers bustling around. No mechanics shouting over the whir of air guns. Just the humming of the lights overhead and the static crackle of a distant comm system. It felt like the world had shrunk to this exact moment. Just the two of them. The past. The present. And a future neither had dared to imagine until now. Then Hamilton finally spoke, his voice quiet, uncertain, the tone of a man teetering between hope and disbelief. What about the contract? Toto didn't blink. His answer came fast, firm, rehearsed. Leave it to me. No hesitation. No bureaucracy. No red tape. Just conviction. Hamilton nodded slowly, then raised another question, his voice firmer this time. The sponsors. Toto allowed himself a grin, not smug, but confident, almost amused. They'll crawl back. Faster than they left. There's nothing they crave more than a redemption arc. Lewis tilted his head slightly, thinking. The media? And Toto, ever the strategist, smirked fully now. They adore a comeback. Especially when it bleeds. You've given them drama, heartbreak, betrayal. Now give them vengeance. Hamilton looked down at the floor, inhaling deeply. But then slowly, his gaze lifted, sharp as a blade, eyes burning with something long dormant. And then came the question. The only one that truly mattered. The one that pierced through the corporate politics, the contracts, the strategy boards, the billions in sponsorship. Will the team accept me? There was a beat. And then Toto stepped forward, breaking the space between them, placing a hand on Hamilton's shoulder. It wasn't just a gesture of reassurance, it was a coronation. They never stopped missing you. And in that moment, something inside Lewis cracked, not in the way glass breaks from weakness, but in the way a cocoon splits when it's time to emerge. A breath escaped his lips that felt like it had been trapped there since Abu Dhabi 2021. Since the late-night calls with Ferrari. Since the quiet betrayal of being used as a symbol, but never embraced as a leader. Since the brief, confused, self-destructive attempt to rewrite his own legend in red. It all began to dissolve. The doubts. The anger. The fractures in his soul that had been taped over with interviews, designer suits, and hollow PR statements. It all began to heal, not instantly, not fully, but the process had started. There in that dim half-lit Mercedes garage where championship banners still hung like echoes of greatness, Hamilton found the one thing he had lost. Purpose. He wasn't just coming back. He was coming back with scars, with knowledge, with rage, with redemption in his veins. This wasn't 2014 Hamilton, brash and bulletproof. This wasn't 2020 Hamilton, godlike and unchallenged. This was Hamilton 2.0. The broken. The reforged. The unstoppable. Toto didn't say anything more. He didn't need to. The silence between them said it all. They both knew what came next. Calls would be made. Engines would be prepared. Strategies rewritten. And the rest of the paddock? They'd have no idea what storm was building behind the scenes. Because Lewis Hamilton wasn't just returning. He was resurrecting. And this time, he wouldn't be fighting for legacy. He'd be fighting for vengeance. For Ferrari's betrayal. For the silence after Abu Dhabi. For every headline that called him finished. For every team principal that closed a door. For every fan who whispered that maybe he should have walked away. They were wrong. He wasn't done. He was reloading. And when he hit the grid again, Formula One would tremble. The morning sun crept over the circuit with its usual golden flare, casting long shadows across the empty pit lane. The crews rolled in, coffee in hand, unsuspecting. The paddock buzzed with the mundane rhythm of a Grand Prix weekend. Journalists checking their schedules, engineers discussing tire degradation, photographers framing their morning shots. But what they didn't know, what no one outside a very tight circle could possibly suspect, was that behind closed doors, a seismic shift was quietly, efficiently, and ruthlessly unfolding. Somewhere inside a sleek, nondescript office suite buried in the administrative wing of the paddock, the conversation was already underway. No media. No managers. Just Mercedes' legal team, Ferrari's top brass, and 2 non-disclosure agreements thicker than a race strategy dossier. The kind of talks that would never be acknowledged publicly until it was too late to stop the avalanche they would unleash. Emails were exchanged with subject lines so bland they could have belonged to a travel agency. Phone calls were taken in coded language. Private jets were placed on standby. Every single move was deliberate, strategic, and masked in layers of discretion. But the urgency wasn't lost on anyone behind those doors. This wasn't a discussion for 2026. This wasn't about retirement, legacy deals, or farewell tours. This was about now. This was about a betrayal that had already been signed in silence. Toto Wolff wasn't just watching the chaos unfold at Ferrari. He was engineering a comeback, a rescue mission disguised as a masterstroke. He had no interest in waiting for the season to settle. He didn't want headlines about 2027. He wanted Lewis Hamilton back in silver before summer. Before Austria. Before the world had time to process what was happening. On Mercedes' side, the plan was clinical. Clean extraction. Minimal PR damage. Just enough ambiguity to allow Hamilton to conclude his commitment to Ferrari without igniting a lawsuit. And if Ferrari tried to resist, Mercedes was prepared. They had leverage. They had evidence. They had documented every clause in Lewis's contract that left the door cracked open. All they needed was the right moment to blow it wide. On Ferrari's side, chaos. Frantic Zoom calls between Maranello and the boardroom. Vasseur pacing like a man trying to halt an avalanche with a coffee spoon. He had pushed for Hamilton. Had sold the dream to the board. Had strutted like a king after the announcement. But now? Now he was drowning in the consequences of his own arrogance. The culture hadn't changed. The politics hadn't faded. And his treatment of Hamilton, those sharp comments, the lack of accountability, the emotional distance, had come back like a boomerang made of fire. The board was livid. The media was circling like vultures. And Vasseur? He was begging. Reports leaked of desperate pleas to reverse the course of last-minute offers, of attempts to place blame elsewhere, to say it was a misunderstanding, that Lewis had misread his intentions, that the dynamic was reparable. But it wasn't. Because the truth was simpler than any corporate spin, the trust was gone. The bridge had been burned with precision. Not with one match, but with a series of small fires that no one bothered to extinguish. The paddock, meanwhile, remained oblivious, for now. But inside the garage, the atmosphere was thick. The engineers could feel it. The mechanics avoided eye contact. The press officers rehearsed answers to questions that hadn't been asked yet. And the drivers? The silence between them said more than any press conference ever could. Charles Leclerc, the golden child, the face of Ferrari's future, the man once hailed as the perfect teammate, now found himself tangled in a web he didn't weave. He hadn't asked for this. He hadn't schemed for Hamilton's downfall. In fact, just weeks ago, he had been the only one to offer Lewis comfort when Vasseur's biting remarks had cut too deep. He defended him behind closed doors. He tried to build a bridge when everyone else was content to let it collapse. But now he was left watching the unraveling like a passenger on a train heading straight for a cliff, powerless to stop it. He saw it in Hamilton's eyes during the last debrief. The absence. The detachment. The quiet fury that replaced words. Leclerc had tried to speak, tried to offer something, anything, but Lewis had just nodded and looked away. They didn't need to say it out loud anymore. The writing was on the garage wall. And despite everything, despite the competition, the politics, the media's attempts to manufacture a feud, Charles felt a sinking guilt. Because he knew. Deep down, he knew this wasn't about setup issues, or telemetry gaps, or even strategy disagreements. It was about culture. About a team that demanded loyalty while offering none in return. About a structure so archaic that even a 7-time world champion could be belittled if he didn't immediately deliver miracles. About a leadership style so cold, so rigid, that even greatness could be frozen out. Leclerc didn't want this. He didn't want to be the reason Lewis left. But even more painful was the truth creeping into his heart like a slow poison. He knew nothing would change. Not really. Ferrari was still Ferrari, brilliant and broken in equal measure. And Lewis? He was done waiting. The old lion had roared silently for months. He had endured. He had hoped. But now, the roar was becoming action. Strategic. Inevitable. And soon, very soon, the paddock would wake up to a headline they weren't prepared for. Not just a departure. Not just a transfer. But a statement. Hamilton was never theirs to keep. And Ferrari never truly deserved him. He woke before dawn. Not from an alarm. Not from routine. From instinct. From that familiar, electric tension in the chest, a sensation he hadn't felt in years. Lewis Hamilton stared at the ceiling of his home in Monaco, the early sunlight just beginning to fight its way through the curtains. His phone was already buzzing on the nightstand. Hundreds of missed messages. Mentions. Alerts. But none of it mattered anymore. The news was out. The truth had finally broken through the diplomatic fog. The statement had dropped like a bomb. No fanfare. No press conference. Just a single line sent across the wires, stamped in cold, corporate clarity. Scuderia Ferrari and Lewis Hamilton have mutually agreed to terminate their contract, effective immediately. It was over. Publicly. Officially. Irreversibly. No spin. No poetic send-off. No tribute montage. Just silence. And then, a roar. Because precisely 57 minutes and 13 seconds later, the Formula One world collapsed and rebuilt itself in the blink of a tweet. From the official at Mercedes AMG F1 account came 7 words that detonated across the planet like a tidal wave. He's coming home. Hamilton x Mercedes. 2025. No hashtags. No emojis. No date. Just a statement soaked in nostalgia and nuclear-level intent. Within seconds, social media ignited. The timeline fractured into chaos. Twitter trended in 29 countries. Instagram Reels showing Lewis in silver replays racked up millions of views in minutes. TikTok edits started pouring in. Flashbacks of Lewis's dominant 2014 to 2020 run. Bono's iconic Get In There Lewis, Toto Wolff slamming his headset, Rosberg clashes, Max battles, Brazil 2021 comebacks. All stitched into emotional montages laced with dramatic music and teary-eyed fans whispering, "He's back." Sky Sports interrupted its live coverage with breaking news. Commentators were yelling. Analysts were scrambling. Former drivers were dropping bombshell takes. "This is the greatest return in the history of the sport," one pundit said. "It's not just Hamilton rejoining Mercedes, it's the second coming." Some fans wept. Others screamed. But all of them felt it, that seismic pulse in the spine. The electricity. The goosebumps. The air had shifted. The second Lewis Hamilton era at Mercedes wasn't a comeback. It was a resurrection. While the rest of the paddock reeled, Brackley went into immediate lockdown. Lights in the Mercedes factory stayed on all night. Key engineers were pulled from other programs. Confidential meetings were scheduled in private corners of the wind tunnel. Senior aerodynamicists were seen boarding flights from Stuttgart to Northamptonshire. Old names long retired were being reactivated. The whispers grew louder. They're building something. But it wasn't just hardware. It was spiritual. Back inside the walls of the Mercedes-AMG Petronas Technology Center, where posters of Lewis still hung untouched by time, the old guard was reassembling. Familiar faces, long drifted into new roles or other industries, were suddenly back on the company slack. And then came the biggest confirmation of all. Bono was back. Peter Bonington. The man who had walked through every fire with Lewis. The engineer whose voice had guided Hamilton to every win, every comeback, every miracle. The comms were being tested again. Their language. Their rhythm. That invisible bond that no other driver-engineer pairing had ever fully replicated. They didn't need to relearn anything. They just pressed play. And while the media speculated about 2026 regulations, contract clauses, power unit upgrades, Hamilton wasn't talking. He was working. Word leaked from deep within Mercedes HQ, not from PR, but from someone in the simulation bay. Hamilton was in the sim. All night. Running lap after lap. Imola. Monaco. Silverstone. Spa. Suzuka. Not because he was told to. Not for the cameras. But because the flame was back. The hunger that Ferrari never understood. The obsession that couldn't be scripted. The drive that couldn't be coached. He wasn't doing it for revenge. He was doing it for redemption. And this time, there were no distractions. No red mist clouding his judgment. No Italian politics. No Maranello traditions. No conflict between vision and structure. No systems trying to cage him. This wasn't a move. It was a release. A return to the place where his greatness wasn't just respected, it was weaponized. Hamilton wasn't just returning to Mercedes. He was returning to himself. Every mechanic remembered 2020. The brutal dominance. The wet weather performances that defied physics. The energy in the garage when Lewis walked in. Calm, focused, lethal. That feeling had returned. And Toto? He hadn't smiled this wide in months. They had survived the drought. They'd weathered the Red Bull era. They'd taken the criticism. They'd endured the rebuilding. And now, they had their general back. Not just for nostalgia, but to win. Because make no mistake, this wasn't a ceremonial return. This wasn't a swan song. Hamilton wasn't chasing one last podium. He was chasing the fire. The reset. The record. The redemption arc the sport was never ready for. Back in Maranello, Ferrari's corridors were silent. The announcement had been delivered with corporate poise, but inside, there was chaos. The optics team had failed. The dream had collapsed. The man who was meant to lead them to their next title had slipped through their fingers, and returned to the enemy. No one in red dared say it aloud, but the fear was real. What if they made him stronger? What if pushing Hamilton out didn't just light a fuse, but ignited a bomb? What if 2025 wasn't a footnote to a glittering career, but the revenge season of a lifetime? In the days ahead, the grid would prepare for Imola. Press conferences would resume. Contracts would be questioned. Cameras would flash. But beneath the surface, one truth was growing impossible to ignore. Formula One had just changed. Again. Hamilton was no longer a fading icon. He was a man on a mission. Not to prove anyone wrong, but to prove himself right. He wasn't running from Ferrari. He was running toward destiny. And this time, he wasn't asking for permission. He was coming for everything.